I'd like to focus on the Department of Justice's procedures as to FISA applications when that process is conducted appropriately. To begin with, FISA surveillance application must include an affidavit from a federal law enforcement officer, correct?
That's correct.
And that affidavit must demonstrate cause to believe that the target of the surveillance is an agent of a foreign power. Is that also right?
Right. If it relates to a U.S. citizen, it has to be that they're a knowing agent. If it's a non-U.S. person, a knowing element is not required.
And it is intended that that affidavit should rely upon reasonable, trustworthy information, is it not?
That's correct.
Right. And in some cases, in including the case of Carter Page, those affidavits, that information can include the use of information obtained from a confidential human source, correct?
That's correct.
And when information from a confidential human source is included, would you agree that it's important that material related to the reliability or trustworthiness of that confidential human source is disclosed within the affidavit?
Yes.
And I believe you testified here earlier today that in this case, information in that Carter Page application related to the reliability and credibility of the confidential human source was not included in these applications. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Would you tell us, in your experience, in your many years working with the department, why is it important that that type of information is included and disclosed to both federal prosecutors and to the court?
There's, when matters are submitted to the court, it's for a reason, or to a judge. It's to let an independent judicial officer weigh the question as to whether probable cause exists or not. In providing that information to independent, objective judicial officers, judicial magistrates, if there's confidential human source information that's being provided, it's important for the person, the judge who's reviewing this, to know what's the basis of the person's knowledge? Is it hearsay, or do they have personal knowledge, as an example? And then whether or not there's some track record or basis to believe that the information would be credible coming from this person.
And of course, at this stage of the proceeding, the person who's the subject of the investigation has no idea that this application is even being made or considered or reviewed by the court in most cases. So
That's
it's
correct.
solely rests with the government, the responsibility to ensure that this power, that this surveillance power that's being used is being done in a way that is appropriate and compliant with the law.
That's correct.
And you mentioned something earlier about that in this case, agents immediately moved to the most intrusive investigative means that were available, referring, of course, to the interception of live communications, correct?
That's correct. In this instance, the Bureau almost immediately, when they opened its full investigations, it was the umbrella case, Crossfire Hurricane, and then the 4 sub-files, they immediately went to try to get FISA coverage on Papadopoulos, which they weren't able to do, and then Carter Page.
And some of the techniques for law enforcement, you know, there are a myriad of other things they can do to collect surveillance information short of this interception of communications, like poll cameras, pen registers, trap and trace, trash pulls, correct? There are many other things that in investigations are often utilized prior to taking this step of attempting to intercept live communications.
Right. Those are typically building blocks for electronic surveillance.
So based on your testimony so far, what we're hearing is that here, a FISA application was pursued without disclosing some relevant information to prosecutors or the court, without following standard procedural rules, utilizing investigative techniques that were the most intrusive without first exhausting other techniques, and instead pursuing the most invasive method possible from the outset against Mr. Page.
That's essentially correct, yes.
Now, one other thing, you mentioned earlier during your testimony that the failures identified during your investigation, that if they were not addressed, they would result in national security risks and continued public lack of confidence in our institutions of justice, that there were no overnight fixes, but we needed accountability, standards, and consequences. Would you elaborate, please?
Time the gentlelady has expired. The witness can respond.
Yeah. the national security interests here include liberties of the American people. One of the things that was most disturbing about the dossier, the Steele dossier, is whether or not this is, so at least some of it was Russian disinformation, whether Igor Danchenko, who personally wrote that he was responsible for 80% of the intelligence in the dossier and 50% of the analysis, whether or not Mr. Danchenko was the source of Russian disinformation. If you don't run some of those things to ground, it does affect the liberties, or potentially affects the liberties of the American people and the national security interests of this country.
Thank you, sir.